Welcome to the Billionaire's Choice. Subscribe and turn on notifications to enjoy more heartwarming stories of love and destiny. Let us know where you're watching from, and let's begin today's story. The announcement echoed through Terminal C, calm and indifferent, informing passengers that the final boarding call for Flight 218 to Seattle would end in just minutes. Maren Holloway tightened her grip on the handle of her Navy suitcase and forced herself to keep walking. She had rehearsed this moment 100 times, promising she would never look back. Inside her shoulder bag rested a neatly folded resignation letter bearing the unmistakable signature of Callum Whitaker, a signature he had written without lifting his eyes from the stack of contracts on his desk, without noticing that the paper he signed would erase the one constant from his daily life. 3 years had been reduced to a line of ink. As she handed her passport to the airline agent, a familiar voice cut through the noise of rolling luggage and hurried conversations. Maren. Her hand froze. Every muscle in her body refused to obey. She closed her eyes for the briefest second before turning. Across the crowded terminal stood Callum Whitaker. His tie hung crooked beneath an unbuttoned collar. His dark overcoat remained open despite the cold air rushing through the automatic doors. His breathing was uneven, as though he had run farther than he ever believed necessary for anyone. People glanced toward him, recognizing the billionaire CEO whose composed presence usually silenced entire boardrooms. Yet the man standing before her looked nothing like the calculating executive whose voice never wavered. For the first time since Maren had met him, he seemed completely unsure of himself. He stepped closer, stopping only when the boarding line separated them. The practice speeches that had earned billion-dollar contracts deserted him. His lips parted once, then again. Finally, only 4 quiet words escaped. "Please, don't go." The sentence landed harder than any shout could have. Maren felt tears burn behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She had spent too many nights swallowing disappointment to break now. She lifted her chin and met his gaze with heartbreaking calm. "Stay with me," he whispered, the plea sounding almost foreign in the mouth of a man who had built an empire by giving orders instead of asking favors. Around them, travelers slowed their pace. A child stopped tugging his mother's sleeve. Even the airline agent hesitated before lowering Maren's passport onto the counter. Silence stretched between them until Maren finally spoke, her voice gentle enough not to wound him, yet steady enough to protect herself. "Stay." "As what, Mr. Whitaker?" The honorific struck him harder than anger ever could. For 3 years she had called him that every working day, but now the distance inside those words felt immeasurable. Callum opened his mouth, searching for an answer he should have found long before this moment. Employer? Friend? The woman he could no longer imagine beginning another morning without? None of the words reached his lips. He stood motionless as the final boarding announcement echoed again through the terminal. Maren looked at him one last time, seeing not the untouchable billionaire the world admired, but a man who had realized the value of a heart only after watching it walk away. 3 months earlier, she still believed she was nothing more than another name on his calendar, another meeting to schedule, another problem to solve. What Callum didn't know was that Seattle wasn't simply a new job. It was the first step toward the life she had quietly postponed for years, and the only way to save herself from loving a man who had never truly seen her. 3 months earlier, before airport terminals, unanswered questions, and impossible goodbyes, Maren Holloway's mornings always began 15 minutes before Callum Whitaker's. By the time the billionaire CEO stepped out of the private elevator on the top floor of Whitaker Aeronautics, his schedule had already been adjusted 3 times. 2 meetings quietly moved, and 1 potential crisis prevented before he even knew it existed. No one understood how she did it. Employees joked that Maren could predict the weather inside Callum's office better than the city's forecast. They weren't entirely wrong. She knew that if the untouched cup of black coffee remained on his desk past 9 o'clock, he hadn't slept the night before. If he absent-mindedly rotated the old silver ring he no longer wore on his finger, someone had reminded him of the fiancée who had once betrayed him by selling company secrets. And whenever he addressed her as Miss Holloway, instead of simply Maren, she knew another invisible wall had risen around him. She never took it personally. She simply adjusted the day's rhythm to give him room to breathe. Callum rarely thanked anyone. Gratitude wasn't spoken in his world. It appeared as unexpected salary increases, generous bonuses, and promotions buried inside revised contracts. Marin accepted them with the same quiet professionalism she brought to everything else, never confusing appreciation with affection. Instead of demanding recognition, she focused on the details no one else noticed. She replaced meetings with conference calls whenever his migraines became unbearable. She quietly sent executives home rather than letting them witness the exhaustion he tried so hard to hide. One rainy evening, after finding him still working long after the building had emptied, she left his medication beside a glass of water with a handwritten note that simply read, "A company can survive one evening without you." The next morning the medicine was gone. The note wasn't. Weeks later, while searching for a contract in his desk drawer, she accidentally caught sight of the folded paper still tucked neatly beneath several confidential files. He had kept it, though he had never mentioned it. There were other small things that became part of their silent routine. An old boarding pass served as Marin's bookmark during the rare quiet lunches she spent reading in the break room, a reminder of a journey she still hoped to take someday. On Callum's wrist rested the watch his late father had worn until the day he died. It always ran exactly 7 minutes fast, and despite repeated offers to repair it, Callum refused. Some memories, he believed, deserved to remain untouched. And inside the locked drawer of Marin's desk rested an unsigned resignation letter she had, rewritten more times than she cared to admit, never finding the courage to hand it over. To everyone else, they looked like a perfectly efficient employer and employee. But efficiency had quietly become dependence. Neither of them realized it yet. Then, late one evening, long after the cleaning staff had finished their rounds and the city lights shimmered against the office windows, Marin returned to Callum's office carrying documents he had forgotten to review. She pushed open the door without knocking, expecting to find him working as always. Instead, she stopped in silence. The most controlled man she had ever known was sitting alone in the darkness, one hand gripping the edge of his desk so tightly that his knuckles had turned white, while the other trembled so violently he could barely hold it still. For one terrifying second, Marin thought Callum was having a heart attack. His breathing came in short, uneven bursts, his shoulders rigid as though every muscle had forgotten how to relax. Beads of sweat clung to his forehead despite the cool office air. She instinctively reached for her phone to call emergency services, but stopped herself. Over the past 3 years, she had learned something far more important than every executive protocol in the company. Callum Whitaker hated losing control, especially in front of another person. Instead of rushing toward him, she quietly placed the documents on a nearby chair and pulled another chair several feet away, careful not to invade the space he was desperately trying to protect. "I'm here," she said softly. "You don't have to speak." He didn't answer. His eyes remained fixed on the floor as his trembling hands struggled to obey him. Marin kept her own breathing slow and steady, hoping he would unconsciously follow the rhythm. After several silent moments, she spoke again. "Look at me, Callum." The sound of his first name made him lift his eyes just enough to meet hers. "Tell me 5 things you can see." He frowned as if the request made no sense. "The window," he whispered after a long pause. "The desk, your notebook, the lamp, and—" His breathing caught again. "Good," Marin encouraged without moving an inch closer. "Now 4 things you can touch." Little by little, guided only by her calm voice, he named the leather chair beneath him, the polished edge of the desk, the fabric of his sleeve, and the cold surface of the watch his father had once worn. His breathing gradually slowed. The violent trembling eased. Nearly 10 minutes passed before the silence in the office no longer felt frightening. Callum leaned back, exhausted, staring at the ceiling as though ashamed of what she had witnessed. "I've never let anyone see that before," he admitted quietly. The confession sounded heavier than any business secret. After another long silence, he finally spoke about the memory he had buried for years. His first company had collapsed when he was still trying to prove himself to his father. The financial ruin triggered so much stress that his father suffered a fatal heart attack only days later. Then, years afterward, the woman he had planned to marry betrayed him by selling confidential company information to a competitor. Since then, Callum had convinced himself that emotions clouded judgment, trust invited betrayal, and absolute control was the only thing standing between success and disaster. Marin listened without interrupting. She offered neither pity nor easy reassurance. When he finished, she simply said, "Control can protect a company, but it can't convince people to stay. Sometimes it only teaches them to keep their distance." The words lingered between them longer than either expected. For the first time in 3 years, Callum looked directly at her, not as an assistant waiting for instructions, but as the only person who had seen him completely vulnerable and chosen not to take advantage of it. "Thank you, Marin," he said quietly, speaking her name without titles, without formality, and without hiding behind authority. Something fragile shifted between them that night, something neither of them fully understood. Yet when the sun rose over Manhattan the next morning, the office doors opened, executives filled the hallways, and Callum's familiar armor returned. Without meeting her eyes, he handed Marin a folder and said in his usual cold, controlled voice, "Miss Holloway, reschedule my 10 o'clock meeting." It was as if the man who had trusted her in the darkness had disappeared before daylight could expose him. Life inside Whitaker Aeronautics gradually slipped back into its familiar rhythm, but something invisible had changed. Callum never mentioned the night Marin had seen him fall apart, yet his actions quietly began to betray a dependence he refused to acknowledge. On the rare afternoons when Marin left the office before sunset for a doctor's appointment or to visit her mother, he would casually ask, "Where are you going?" as though it were merely a scheduling concern. If she called in sick, he canceled investor dinners without explanation and instructed his private physician to visit her apartment. When the invoice arrived, he approved it under the cold, impersonal description of employee wellness expense. Marin recognized the gesture for what it was, but she also understood he was still hiding behind policies instead of honesty. Their days became filled with small moments that no one else noticed. More than once they found themselves eating takeout Chinese food at 2 in the morning while reviewing contracts before a product launch. One freezing winter morning, a fresh cup of coffee appeared on her desk before she arrived. When she thanked him, Callum glanced at his laptop without looking up and replied, "The cafe made an extra by mistake." She smiled but said nothing. They both knew the cafe downstairs never made mistakes. One afternoon she finally convinced him to let her clean and adjust his late father's old wristwatch. The mechanism was simple enough to repair, but after testing it she deliberately set it 7 minutes fast again before fastening it back onto his wrist. When he noticed, he raised an eyebrow. "You fixed it?" "Yes," she answered softly. "Then why is it still wrong?" Marin smiled. "Because not every memory needs to be corrected." For the first time in days, the corners of Callum's mouth almost formed a smile before disappearing again. He found himself glancing toward the empty chair outside his office whenever she stepped away, realizing only after several minutes that he had been waiting for the sound of her footsteps returning. Yet every time his heart moved closer, his words pulled farther away. The contradiction reached its peak during the Whitaker Foundation's annual charity gala. Marin attended in a simple navy evening dress that reflected her quiet elegance rather than wealth. While greeting guests, one influential female shareholder looked Marin up and down with open disdain before saying loudly enough for nearby executives to hear, "I suppose every billionaire needs reliable hired help." The conversation around them fell silent. Before Marin could respond, Callum turned toward the woman, his expression colder than anyone in the ballroom had ever seen. "Miss Holloway is the reason half this room received their invitations on time," he said evenly. "And she's the reason the other half still chooses to do business with me." The shareholder fell silent immediately. For one brief moment, Marin felt seen. But that fragile feeling lasted only minutes. Later that evening, a business reporter approached Callum with a smile and asked the question that had fueled months of corporate gossip. "Mr. Whitaker, many people believe Miss Holloway is more than your executive assistant. Is there someone special in your life?" Callum answered without hesitation, his voice calm, professional, and devastatingly distant. "She's my employee, nothing more." He never realized Marin had stopped just outside the interview circle. She heard every word. She remained perfectly composed until she reached her apartment that night. Then she opened the email she had been unable to answer for weeks. It was the official offer from a nonprofit organization in Seattle seeking an operations director for a program helping women rebuild their careers after years away from the workforce. The dream she had once quietly shared during a conversation Callum had seemed too distracted to hear. This time, without allowing herself another excuse, Marin clicked one button. "Accept." Marin waited until everyone had left before placing a sealed envelope on Callum Whitaker's desk. According to company policy, she was giving 30 days notice. According to her heart, she had already spent far longer saying goodbye. Callum glanced at the envelope while reviewing financial reports, assuming it contained another proposal that required his approval. Without opening it, he flipped to the signature page, signed his name with practiced speed, and slid it back across the desk. "Human resources will handle the transition," he said, never lifting his eyes from the documents in front of him. Marin remained standing for several silent seconds, hoping, just once, that he would look up, that he would ask a single question, that he would notice the trembling hand holding the envelope he had just returned. He didn't. She quietly placed the spare office key beside his coffee cup and walked out without another word. 2 days later, while searching for another contract, Callum unfolded the papers he had signed so carelessly. His expression changed the moment he reached the first line. It wasn't a proposal. It was Marin's resignation. The letter explained that she had accepted the position of operations director for a nonprofit organization in Seattle dedicated to helping women rebuild their careers after years away from the workforce. As he read further, a distant memory returned. Months earlier, during one of their late-night work sessions, Marin had casually mentioned that if she ever left the corporate world, she wanted to build something that gave people a second chance. He had seemed too busy answering emails to respond. She had assumed he hadn't heard a word. Yet now every sentence echoed inside his mind. Before the end of the day, Callum summoned her into his office. He remained standing behind his desk, the resignation letter resting between them. "Double your salary," he said without preamble. "Stay." Marin smiled sadly. "No." He frowned, genuinely surprised. Money had solved almost every professional problem he had ever faced. "Then equity," he continued. "A larger title. Name your terms." She shook her head again. "That's not why I'm leaving." For the first time, uncertainty crept into his voice. "Then tell me what you want." Marin looked at him quietly before answering. "You're trying to buy back someone you've never truly seen." The word struck, harder than any accusation. Callum immediately replied, convinced he was defending the truth. "I know exactly how valuable you are." Marin's eyes softened with disappointment rather than anger. "You know my value to your company," she said gently. "You know how many crises I prevent, how many hours I work, how much profit my decisions protect. That's productivity, Callum. It isn't the same as seeing the person standing in front of you." Silence settled over the office. For the first time in years, the brilliant businessman had no negotiation left to offer. Marin picked up the resignation letter, placed it neatly back inside the envelope, and walked toward the door. Before leaving, she paused without turning around. "I hope one day you build a life where people stay because they're loved, not because they're well paid." The door closed softly behind her. Callum remained frozen, staring at the empty space she had left behind. He had finally looked up, but only after she had already begun walking away. Neither of them noticed that elsewhere in the building, Vice Chairman Gideon Shaw was quietly setting the next stage of his plan into motion. While Callum struggled to stop the one person holding his life together from leaving, false evidence was already being prepared to make it appear that Marin intended to steal the company's most valuable confidential data before her final day. Only 4 days remained before Marin's final day at Whitaker Aeronautics when the company awoke to a crisis that sent panic through every department. Confidential documents detailing the firm's newest aerospace technology had disappeared from the secure research server. Within hours, anonymous screenshots appeared online suggesting that the files had been copied using credentials assigned to Marin Holloway's executive account. By noon, whispers had spread through every hallway. Some employees refused to believe it. Others quietly avoided meeting her eyes. Marin herself stood frozen in the executive conference room as members of the legal department projected the evidence onto a massive screen. Login records, download timestamps, security camera footage showing someone entering the restricted archive wearing clothing remarkably similar to hers. The footage itself never clearly showed the person's face. A hood concealed most of her features, leaving investigators to rely almost entirely on the access logs and digital credentials when identifying the suspect. The evidence appeared devastating. Only one detail was missing: it wasn't true. "I didn't do this," Marin said calmly. Her voice never rose. She knew panic would only make her look guilty. Vice Chairman Gideon Shaw leaned back in his chair, wearing an expression of practiced disappointment. "No one wants to believe you've betrayed this company," he said smoothly. "But facts are difficult to argue with." Every eye slowly turned toward Callum. For several painful seconds he remained silent, studying the documents before him. Part of him wanted to dismiss the accusation immediately. Marin had protected his company for 3 years. She had countless opportunities to steal information if that had ever been her intention. Yet another part of him, the part scarred by betrayal years earlier, remembered how completely he had trusted his former fiancée before discovering she had sold company secrets. Doubt slipped through the crack fear had left behind. Finally, he looked at Marin. "Until we complete the investigation," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "Company policy requires your security access to be suspended." Those words hurt far more than any accusation Gideon could have invented. Marin searched Callum's face, waiting for the sentence she believed would surely follow. "I know you. I trust you. This isn't you." It never came. A security officer quietly approached and held out his hand. Without resistance, Marin removed her identification badge and placed it in his palm. She then reached into her desk drawer one last time. Inside lay the folded handwritten note she had once left beside Callum's migraine medicine. She stared at it for a brief moment before gently placing it back where it belonged. If he ever opened that drawer again, he would find it. If not, it would disappear with everything else she had quietly given. As she walked through the office carrying only a small cardboard box, employees stepped aside in silence. No one celebrated. No one spoke. They simply watched the woman who had held the company together leave through the front doors under suspicion. From his office window, dozens of floors above, Callum watched her disappear into the crowded Manhattan streets. Something deep inside him urged him to run after her, to tell her he believed her despite everything. Instead, he remained standing perfectly still, convincing himself that waiting for the investigation was the responsible choice. It was the same mistake he had made his entire life, choosing certainty over trust. That evening, after the building emptied, Callum wandered into Marin's office for the first time since she left. Her desk had already been cleared. Only one object remained overlooked inside the bottom drawer, a folder containing years of handwritten contingency plans, emergency contact lists, and detailed notes anticipating problems before they happened. Tucked between those pages rested a boarding pass to Seattle, and beneath it, the little note he had kept for months, now carefully preserved as though someone had wanted him to remember that even the strongest people sometimes needed someone to remind them to take their medicine. The investigation moved quickly, but the truth moved faster. Late that night, Callum sat alone in Marin's abandoned office, unable to ignore the uneasiness growing inside him. He opened every folder she had left behind, expecting meticulous work schedules and transition notes. Instead, he discovered something far more painful. There were handwritten contingency plans for nearly every crisis the company had survived over the past 3 years, each dated days before the problems had ever reached his desk. Every emergency that had seemed to resolve itself had first been quietly anticipated by Marin. At the bottom of one notebook, he found a list titled, "Things Mr. Whitaker Forgets When He's Under Pressure." The first item read, "Migraine medicine, left drawer." The second, "Father's watch runs 7 minutes fast. Never correct it unless he asks." The third simply said, "Remind him to eat before investor meetings." There was no complaint, no expectation of gratitude, only quiet observations from someone who had spent years protecting another person's life without asking to be noticed. His chest tightened. Then another discovery changed everything. The building's cybersecurity director requested permission to review archived network logs after noticing several authentication records that did not match Marin's usual behavior. Within hours, forensic specialists uncovered evidence that the login credentials had been cloned from a temporary backup token issued weeks earlier during a server upgrade. The copied credentials had then been routed through a hidden administrator account authorized only by members of the executive board. The trail led directly to Vice Chairman Gideon Shaw's office. At first, Gideon denied every accusation and ordered his legal team to challenge the investigation. When confronted with the evidence, Gideon attempted to destroy files stored on his encrypted laptop, but investigators recovered enough data to expose the entire scheme. He had orchestrated the false accusation to eliminate Marin before she could uncover financial irregularities tied to several unauthorized consulting contracts he had quietly approved for companies he secretly controlled. Faced with overwhelming forensic evidence and the arrival of federal investigators, Gideon finally confessed to orchestrating the scheme. The board removed him immediately, and federal investigators arrived before sunset. News spread through headquarters in minutes. Employees who had watched Marin leave in silence now stood speechless, realizing they had witnessed the company betray its most loyal employee. But Callum barely heard any of it. His attention had fallen upon one final item resting inside Marin's desk drawer, a worn envelope containing every handwritten note she had ever left for him over the years. The migraine reminder, the encouragement before difficult negotiations, the tiny messages wishing him luck before product launches. She had made copies of each one, perhaps without even realizing she was preserving pieces of a life she would eventually leave behind. Tucked beneath them was a single folded page addressed not to the company, but to him. It was never meant to be delivered. There was no signature, only one unfinished sentence. One day, I hope you discover that being needed and being loved are not the same thing. Callum closed his eyes as the weight of every missed opportunity crashed over him. He finally understood why her resignation had never been about salary, promotions, or recognition. She hadn't left because she stopped caring. She had left because she had cared for too long without ever being allowed to become anything more than indispensable. He looked at the calendar on his desk. Marin's flight to Seattle departed the following morning. His eyes dropped to the boarding pass she had accidentally left behind in the drawer. The flight number burned into his memory. Without another thought, he grabbed his car keys, his father's watch, and the folded resignation letter he had once signed without reading. For the first time in years, Callum Whitaker abandoned a board meeting, ignored ringing phones, and ran, not toward another business deal, but toward the only person who had ever quietly made his life feel like home. Traffic seemed determined to punish every second Callum Whitaker had wasted over the past 3 years. Manhattan streets crawled beneath endless lines of red brake lights while the clock on the dashboard mocked him with every passing minute. His father's old watch still ran 7 minutes fast, yet for the first time in his life, even those borrowed minutes could not save him. He abandoned his car 3 blocks from the airport and ran the remaining distance, ignoring reporters calling his name and security personnel trying to recognize the billionaire sprinting through the terminal carrying nothing but a folded resignation letter and a boarding pass that no longer belonged to him. By the time he reached the departure hall, the final boarding announcement for the Seattle flight echoed across the airport. Beyond the security checkpoint, he caught sight of Marin standing near the boarding gate with a small suitcase beside her. She looked peaceful, not happy, not heartbroken, simply peaceful, as though she had finally stopped carrying a weight that had never been hers alone. Marin. His voice rose above the noise of the terminal. She turned slowly. Surprise crossed her face as she watched the man who had always walked with perfect composure now struggling to catch his breath. Airport security stopped him at the screening checkpoint just as Marin stepped through the boarding scanner. Hearing someone call her name, she turned around. The gate agent glanced at the boarding line, then quietly allowed her a few extra moments before the doors closed. He stopped a few feet away, exhausted, his hands shaking far more violently than they had on the night she found him in his dark office months before. For several moments, neither of them spoke. Finally, Callum managed the only words that truly mattered. "Please, don't go." Marin's eyes filled with emotion, but she remained still. "The investigation proved everything," he continued. Gideon confessed. "The board knows you're innocent. I should have trusted you from the beginning." She nodded gently. "I know." His voice cracked with regret. "I failed you." She didn't argue. She didn't comfort him. She simply let the truth exist between them. Callum unfolded the resignation letter he had once signed without reading. Slowly, he tore it into small pieces, letting them fall into the nearby recycling bin. Then he reached into his coat pocket and placed the little handwritten medicine note into her hands. Its edges were worn from months of being unfolded and folded again. "I kept this," he whispered, "because it was the first time someone cared whether I survived the day, instead of whether I closed the deal." Marin looked down at the faded handwriting before lifting her eyes back to him. "Callum." He took a slow breath. forcing himself to do something he had avoided his entire life. You once told me I only knew your value to the company. His voice trembled. You were right. I measured everything in profit, efficiency, and performance because I was terrified that if I admitted I needed someone, I'd lose them. He stepped one pace closer. I'm done hiding behind titles. For the first time since they met, he reached for her hand instead of handing her another document. Stay with me, he said quietly. Not as my assistant. Not because of a contract. Not because of a salary. Stay because I love you. And if you still choose Seattle, I'll accept it. I won't ask you to sacrifice your dream for mine. I just couldn't let you leave without finally telling you the truth. Tears gathered in Marin's eyes. She smiled through them, remembering the question she had asked at this very airport only hours earlier in another lifetime. Stay. As what, Mr. Whitaker? Callum smiled for the first time without restraint, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. As the woman I hope will never have to wonder again whether she's seen. The final boarding call sounded one last time, but neither of them looked toward the gate. For the first time, neither of them was running away. 6 months later, the headquarters of Whitaker Aeronautics felt different in ways that had nothing to do with profits or stock prices. Employees noticed that meetings no longer stretched through the night without reason. Junior staff were encouraged to leave on time. Executives were encouraged to share the common cafeteria several days each week, and even the CEO could often be found standing in line alongside interns and new employees. Near the elevators hung a small framed card written in familiar handwriting. A company can survive one evening without you. No name appeared beneath the sentence, but those who had known Marin smiled every time they passed it. Callum had never removed it. He had simply made sure everyone could read it. Marin had accepted a different kind of future than the one she had originally planned. Instead of leaving for Seattle immediately, she worked with the nonprofit remotely while helping Whitaker Aeronautics establish a foundation that funded career retraining programs for parents returning to the workforce, military veterans beginning civilian careers, and professionals rebuilding their lives after unexpected setbacks. She partnered with the Whitaker Foundation while continuing her nonprofit work remotely, allowing both missions to strengthen one another instead of competing for her time. It wasn't a compromise of her dream. It was its expansion. One crisp autumn afternoon, Callum arrived at the Foundation's community center carrying 2 cups of coffee. Marin laughed as she accepted one. Don't tell me the cafe made an extra again. He smiled, unembarrassed this time. No, I bought yours on purpose. They walked through classrooms filled with people preparing for job interviews, learning new software, and rediscovering confidence they thought they had lost forever. Watching them, Callum finally understood something his younger self had never believed. Success was not measured by how many people depended on you. It was measured by how many people became stronger because you believed in them. Before leaving, Marin noticed him checking the old wristwatch that had belonged to his father. She gently took his hand and compared it with the clock hanging on the wall. It's still 7 minutes fast, she said with a teasing smile. I know, Callum replied. I'm keeping it that way. Why? She asked. He looked at the worn watch before meeting her eyes. Because those 7 minutes remind me that I almost ran out of time. I don't ever want to forget how close I came to losing what mattered most. Marin reached into her bag and unfolded the faded handwritten medicine note he had returned to her at the airport. The paper was old now, its edges softened by years of careful handling. She slipped it back into the inside pocket of his jacket exactly where she had found it months earlier. You still need someone to remind you sometimes, she whispered. Callum laughed quietly. Probably always will. This time, instead of hiding his hand in his pocket or burying himself in work, he simply intertwined his fingers with hers as they stepped outside together. The afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the sidewalk ahead, but neither of them feared the future anymore. They had learned that love was not proven by grand speeches or expensive gifts. It was built in quiet moments, remembering medicine, saving an old watch that ran 7 minutes fast, listening when someone shared a dream, and choosing trust before certainty. Somewhere in another terminal, another flight to Seattle would eventually depart. This time, neither of them needed to be on it. They had already arrived exactly where they were meant to be, not because one person saved the other, but because they finally learned to walk forward side by side, seeing each other not for what they could provide, but for who they had always been. If you enjoyed this story, Please like, share, and subscribe to the Billionaire's Choice. Every week, we bring you heartwarming stories of love, destiny, and life-changing decisions. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss a new story.